you've ever taken an interest in, especially, theistic or Christian apologetics, or been introduced to classical or medieval philosophy, then you've probably heard some arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah, a couple.
Personally, I've always found that the moral argument and then certain versions of the ontological argument are the most convincing for me.
Oh, so you're a moron. Thanks for letting us know right off the bat.
But I recently had what I might call like a breakthrough in my own appreciation for St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological arguments that might just now make them my new favorites. And the reason is because I was introduced to an analogy that helped me kind of close the gaps in my own understanding of how they work and what it is that makes them so convincing. And I realized after I had this epiphany that it would be greedy of me to keep it to myself.
Right, because you're such a towering intellect that you've been able to fix the problems no one's been able to solve for the last 700 years.
So imagine you're in just a wide open space that stretches on seemingly to infinity in every direction.
Oh, I don't have to imagine it. Hang on. Okay, I'm there. Go on.
But like the environment that you experience here on Earth, everything that appears in this space is pulled downward by something like a gravitational force, even though there's no ground.
But if there's no ground to compare it to, then in what way am I falling? Okay, so I have myself, my boombox, a watermelon, and my autographed picture of Albert Einstein sticking his tongue out. Now, what old Einstein discovered is that absent any kind of ground that we can detect, there's no way to tell if we're falling or just floating in space. There's no test whatsoever that will tell us that. Just look up the equivalence principle if you want to know more.
I get that doesn't make sense, but just indulge me. It's hypothetical.
Yeah, well, a hypothetical has to at least be comprehensible.
And for the sake of those drawn towards pedantic questions, those of us who are in this space were supported by a platform that prevents us from falling down.
Wait, so there is a ground after all? Why did you specifically say there was no ground if you were just gonna make a ground for us afterward?
And then we notice in this space that there is a chandelier hanging by a chain, and the chain just goes up way beyond our ability to see where it ends. Now, we know everything in this environment, if left unsuspended, will fall, right?
Do we? Because all you've done is create a confusing space where we're not even sure what the laws of physics are.
We can take objects like out of our pockets, for example, and hold them out like this and just let them go, and we notice that they drop into the void.
Wait, I thought there was a platform. You mean we drop it over the edge or something?
But this chandelier that we observe isn't falling. So if we're inquisitive and rational, we would probably ask ourselves, why doesn't the chandelier fall? What's holding it up?
At this point, those are the least of our questions, buddy.
And if you really wanted an explanation that accounted for the actual depths of that question that got right to the heart of it, would you be satisfied if someone answered you by saying, well, it's attached to a chain link right above it. You can see it there. That's what's holding it up. I hope you would say no. I would certainly find that unsatisfying because that raises the inevitable follow-up question, which is, well, what's holding that link up? And an equally unsatisfying answer would be, well, the link above it.
And so you're now saying that an infinite series of chain links is an unreasonable explanation. But why? It would explain exactly why the chandelier doesn't fall. It would have an infinite amount of mass, and therefore would take an infinite amount of force to move it. And assuming gravity works at all like it does in the real world, gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. So they wouldn't have had time to reach all of the infinity of chain links to tell them to fall. This sounds like as good an explanation as any.
None of those explanations really accounts for how the chandelier manages to resist falling into the void.
Yeah, it does! Perfectly!
But just because we can't physically see the end of the chain, that doesn't mean there is no end. That would be jumping to a conclusion that we don't really have the grounds to make.
Okay, that's true. And by the same token, assuming that there must be a top of the chain with something holding it up is jumping to a conclusion that you don't have the grounds to make either.
But even if the chain did go on indefinitely, it still wouldn't explain what's holding it all up.
Yeah, it would. Just explain why.
An infinite regress of explanations that don't actually account for what's going on here isn't a more satisfying explanation.
Sounds perfectly satisfying to me. Not that it's the only explanation or even the most likely one, but really, what's wrong with it? I'd really like an answer for this. All of the Aquinas bozos just claim there's no infinite regress without supporting it.
It's not in their nature to stay suspended. It's in their nature to fall.
No, it is in its nature to stay suspended unless there's a gravitational field. Basic Isaac Newton. It stays put unless moved by a force. And although you claim there is one, you've given us no explanation of what it is, how it works, or where it comes from. In fact, I just thought of another way. What if we follow the chain all the way up and find another chandelier? So now we have two chandeliers, one suspended in one direction and one in the other, held together by a chain, both experiencing a localized downward force that would actually be in two different directions. How could that be, you ask? Well, smart viewers have already figured that out, but since you're an apologist and therefore not very smart, I'll explain it to you. They're spinning! These chandeliers are rotating around the center of the chain, and they have that downward, or really outward, suspension because of their rotational inertia. And this platform we're on, it's circular and rotating too, at the same rate, so the chandelier stays at the same place in relation to us. And that's why we feel gravity where there is none. It even explains why things just drop off into the void when they fall over the edge. Now, we can interrogate this possibility. We can measure the platform to see if there's a subtle curvature so slight we didn't notice it before. We can try to see further out along the platform to detect the curvature that way. We can try to make a telescope to see all the way to the other side of the system. This is a perfect explanation that doesn't even require any external forces or any laws of physics other than what we experience in our own universe. In fact, several times I've shown exactly that in my space station. Its artificial gravity is achieved by rotation, and there's no need for anything to violate its own nature.
Something must be holding the chain up, and it must be in the nature of that thing to not fall.
Why? If there's a thing that has in its nature not to fall, then why can't the chandelier have that nature? And if it's just spinning in a void like I just said, that would be exactly its nature. This special pleading argument fails at the best of times, but somehow you've gone and made it worse.
If we could somehow travel to the end of the chain and observe like a platform that the last link is then anchored to, it would have to be in the nature of that platform not to fall. That's the key logical point in all of this.
That's the violation of logic, because you need that platform to suddenly be operating by different physical laws than the rest of the system.
And to draw incoherent conclusions is to embrace irrationality.
Yes, it is. So why are you doing that?
So let's bring this analogy into our own reality.
I just did that with the rotating system. We don't need anything more than that.
So we observe that you and I and everything around us exist, right? That's pretty obvious. But if we want to understand how we exist, we might ask, well, what causes us to exist?
Look, you guys know this moronic argument as well as I do, so we'll just skip a bit.
Just like with the chandelier, it logically can't be suspended in space unless something is holding it up.
Except it can. Just reminding you of that.
And we haven't found anything that can hold itself up in the observable sequence of causes.
Yes, we can. It's not hard. I just did it.
Therefore, there must be a necessary being, one whose nature is to exist, that causes and sustains all contingent things.
We've already established that you're unable to think for 2 seconds to see how your own analogy can exist on its own. Not only could you not think through the obvious consequences of an infinitely long chain, you couldn't even think far enough ahead to realize that it could just be rotating. And now you think that not only must there be something else, but that something must be a being.
Aristotle called this a necessary thing, and Aristotle's a pretty reliable guide on logical questions like this because he invented logic as we know it. So logically, we know that there must exist what Aristotle calls a necessary thing.
You do realize that concept's been debunked for centuries, right? Maybe you should update your philosophy to something more recent than 24 centuries ago.
This necessary thing isn't just a being like you or I, but being itself, the ground of all being, the platform that the seemingly infinite chain is anchored to that explains how the chandelier is suspended in midair.
Yeah, but see, we don't need a being to explain that. I was able to do it just by rotating everything. And even if I couldn't, all that would mean is that we just don't know what it is. What you're talking about is a literal argument from ignorance. You can't think of what the answer might be, therefore it must be God. Which is where we all know you're going with this, so you might as well stop being coy.
Now, whenever an argument like the one I just made for God's existence is offered, it's always met with a couple objections that I want to address here and anticipate.
Only a couple?
The first is that this only proves that there is a necessary being.
It doesn't even do that. It doesn't prove that there's anything necessary, being or otherwise.
It depends on observing the fact that personal beings, like us, do exist. That is, organisms with intellect and will. So follow that same logic. What explains the existence of these traits, that is, intellect and will? Because the explanation can't be something impersonal.
Why not? You just make these assertions and don't even try to justify them.
In the same way that if we ask what's holding the chandelier up, the cause can't be something that is falling.
But it can be something that is spinning. You couldn't think of that, and that was your analogy. So why should we trust you to be able to think of anything more complicated?
A cause can't give what it doesn't have. A falling object can't be an explanation for a suspended object. Similarly, an irrational, an inanimate, or passive cause cannot be an explanation for a rational and willful effect, which is what we see.
So the only way that something can have a certain ability is if it's created by something with that ability. Another very unjustifiable assumption. We've made planes that can fly, even though we can't. We've made space probes that can survive in vacuum or on Mars, even though we can't survive in those environments. We've made cars that can break the speed of sound, even though we can't break the speed of sound. Not only is there no reason whatsoever to think that something can't make something else that has qualities that it doesn't, we see plenty examples of exactly that.
A cause cannot give what it does not have. This is the principle of proportionate causality.
It's the principle of exorbitant stupidity.
The second argument that I always encounter is that this argument doesn't prove the Christian God. It only proves that some undefined being exists.
Again, it doesn't even do that. You should at least try to respond to some actual counter-arguments. See, I find it exceedingly doubtful that you mentioned this to anyone and they just agreed with you that it supposedly proves these things. It doesn't!
That retort is a textbook red herring fallacy.
No, what you're doing is a textbook straw man fallacy.
If there really is a necessary being from which everything that is contingent, including the whole universe, derives its existence from,
which you have done absolutely nothing to demonstrate,
then what we're talking about here is way out of reach and out of scope for our reason to define in any meaningful way.
So, by your own admission, we're left with just one big, do you not realize how you just peed on your own parade? The atheist position is that we don't know if there's anything outside of the universe or that created the universe, or that even predated the universe, or whatever. And so it's ridiculous to entertain the notion until someone comes up with some reason why that should be. Which, ironically, is exactly what you just tried and failed to do. In order to convince someone not to be an atheist, you need to provide something more than, I don't know.
So, how do we know that?
Know what? You just said it's outside of our reason. So how can we know anything?
Like, we've only explored, 5% of our own oceans?
Okay, but that doesn't mean we should seriously entertain the notion that there are mermaids or krakens or whatever down there. You can't use our ignorance of the ocean to argue for the existence of Neptune or Poseidon or Nerv. And so you can't use our ignorance of the universe to argue for the existence of any other sort of God.
Christianity and the faith of the ancient Israelites before it understands that we only know anything about God because God has told us about himself, which is known as revelation.
Yeah, except for all the other things we've been able to understand. You know, like all of math and science, which we didn't get from him, which we actually had to get rid of a lot of the baggage that we got from it. Things like a flat-domed earth with a firmament, creation ex nihilo, and all sorts of other things that got in the way of our understanding cosmology, biology, electromagnetism, relativity, quantum mechanics, and so on.
So if we want to scrutinize the claims of the Bible, or any other form of revelation for that matter, the question isn't like a scientific or a philosophical one in which we're trying to rationally define who and what God is, because again, that's impossible.
Seems pretty freaking possible to me. You're the one who couldn't even think of the possibility of the chandeliers rotating in your own analogy.
Has it been established that the origin of this supposed revelation has divine qualities?
Well, considering how many things the Bible says that's just plain outright wrong, and that led us down a bunch of blind alleys for centuries, then I'd say no, that hasn't even been remotely established at all.
And the best way to answer that is by looking for the presence of prophecy and miracle, because only God has the power to produce those qualities. So is this source of revelation predicted or anticipated in some way through prophecy? And is that source able to perform signs and wonders that only God could perform? And in the case of Jesus, the answer to both is unequivocally yes.
Well, you did warn us at the beginning that you're a moron, so my fault for expecting anything different, I guess.
Now, I understand that some would dispute that, and the scope of this video isn't to go over all of those points in any detail.
Or indeed any of them. Or indeed to establish anything. Or even to make any goddamn sense whatsoever.
But just to say that that's where the focal point of contention and disagreement should be if you want to affirm or deny that Jesus reveals to us an understanding of who this necessary being known as God is.
No, the focal point of contention is that most of the things we're given are untestable fairy tales, and the things that were testable ended up being wrong. So thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, and go to donate.bogosity.tv to keep me doing what I do. And check out all the great content here, like this video selected just for you.